This is Blaine Scully. Welcome to the Captain's Code. Each week, we talk with the leaders of high-performance teams about the role they play in making a culture of excellence possible. Tara Moeller is a longtime leader in the outdoor and fitness industry, where she has spent the majority of her career working with consumer brands. During her 10 years with Camelback, Specialized Bicycles, and Faraday Bicycles, Tara rapidly created results that included doubling revenues, securing spots on The Ellen Show, creating multi-million-dollar grant programs for underserved youth, and providing emergency hydration packs for first responders of the North Bay wildfires. She was most recently president of Camelback, where she launched the company's first direct-to-consumer platform, where she grew the business by 15%. Tara serves on the board of digital sports coaching and smart apparel company Sensei, as well as on the advisory board of the Harvest Summit. Tara was a two-time captain of the women's rowing team at the University of Kansas and also coached rowing at Stanford University. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You have a fascinating experience and you've done so much already in the sport industry. I'm wondering if you could kind of share a little bit about your journey and where you came from and how you got to where you are today.
How far would you like me to go back?
As long or as far as you want to go. We're here for as long as you want to be.
Present to past, I guess. I just recently finished up as a president of Camelback, going through a really tumultuous time to lead. I went through, I sat as the senior director of marketing there and got moved up to be the interim president role that was supposed to last for 2 months, and that was great. It was almost about a year, and during that time, we went through the Northern California fires, which 3 of our team members were impacted by that, and then a boycott because our ownership, Camelback's ownership, is Vista Outdoors, which owns a significant amount of brands in the firearms and ammunition space. So, of course, of a core Camelback user, that became pretty important during the Parkland shooting. So, can easily segue into saying that being an athlete and having the foundation of knowing a team and knowing how to rally around a single idea, it was profoundly important that I had that background when I was leading in this really, really interesting space.
To touch back on your athletic experience, so at Kansas, you were a rowing athlete, and then you were a captain the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. Could you kind of share a little bit about that experience, that formation of, that foundation that you were able to access later in life?
Yeah, I mean, in high school I was a four-sport athlete, all letters, all this good stuff. So
what sports were you?
Track, basketball, volleyball, and softball. I'm trying to figure out the last Midwest sport. We didn't have soccer, we didn't have swim, we didn't have tennis. And then I thought, and had gotten a bunch of opportunities to be recruited at D1, D2 and D3 schools. And my dad said, you want to be a big fish in a little pond or a little fish in a big pond? And I'm like, I'm not sure what the right answer is here. So I said, okay, it's the small fish in the big pond. So I ended up going to Kansas and thinking I was going to walk onto the volleyball team. And they looked at my 5'7" stature, said, not today, shorty, and I was already dressed. And so I had heard rowing had just gotten a Title IX nod, and so it was a second year varsity, and I knew there were 5 full scholarships for the 72 women. And at that point, being a farmer's daughter, had to kind of hustle for the right opportunity for me, and went over there and truly asked the coach what the numbers need to say for me to be considered for that scholarship, and he told me, and I did it. And then the last 2 years, I was awarded captain. And captain's really interesting when you have a team of 72 females of inspiring, motivating. I'm very much a leader by example and not necessarily a hoorah out there giving some motivational speeches. But it was voted in. It was surprising because I was a junior, asked to come and be a captain, and then again got voted as captain the second year.
And what were your responsibilities as captain of this 72-person team? Yeah. And then obviously, so you kind of have all the, I guess, out of the boat stuff where you're just kind of building the culture as a team, whether in workouts or training, and then actually when it comes to competition and race day, how that transition works for you and that kind of experience?
It's interesting. So as you look at the people on the boat, I sat 7, and 7 is a really formidable spot because you understand and you know very much what is expected of you from the stroke and from the coxswain as for the coach, but you definitely know and you carry the weight of the team, both literally and philosophically of the women behind you. And so you are that moment of understanding what is expected and needed and knowing what the athletes behind you really need. And that kind of has carried me through life in general. I really never knew what the 7th seat was before my coach basically pulled me aside and said, here's what we need from you specifically as a leader. And so what I was able to do really is recruit some amazing women. We were all walk-on the first 2 years, and we were able to recruit some really amazing athletes, both personality-wise and pulled some good numbers. But also being able to take the concerns of the team if they were feeling too overtired or overworked, I could take that back to the coach and we could kind of figure out what made sense for the right training at the right time.
Yeah, my experience as a team leader is almost, when you find yourself in that position, you're almost like a two-way connection, right? You're the connection between the coaching staff and the team, but also the team, the coaching staff. So being able to have that forum for honest communication both ways is hugely important to your ability to be an effective member of that group.
And it's interesting too, as you relate that, those experiences to leading a brand and leading a company and leading organizations, is you learn really quickly what to take on and absorb as an athlete or as a human being, and then you know what you need to filter and send on to have that transparent leadership style, if you will, if that makes sense to you, right? So you sort of know what you need to absorb, and you know what you need to legitimately pass on and not protect. So it was an interesting moment for me, as I never really led before being a team captain. And they always say, leaders aren't born, they're made. And I believe that, but in the same aspect, you do have an aptitude of becoming a good leader if that opportunity there exists and is presented to you.
How did you transition from, so when you were a rowing captain, to someone who led by example, but then all of a sudden you're in charge of teams, in a way, like when we're an athlete, you can just demonstrate your leadership just by going out and trying your guts out, right? But when you're a leader of a team, like communicating the vision, communicating what our values are, and then building that internal team, but then also connecting that to the outside world, I imagine is a pretty comprehensive challenge and transition individually.
Mm-hmm. It is. You have to, and it's something I learned really in the first 6 years of my career. I spent at Specialized Bicycles, and I was, when I couldn't communicate what I needed out of the team by showing, I would just do it and keep working it. And I was killing myself, right? Because I didn't have the skills, or I hadn't quite understood what it took to communicate what I need, and then move aside and let those people that are far better equipped to do those activities, if you will, right? So for example, I would just almost micromanage the heck out of things, and because I thought, I need the outcome to look like this, and there's only one way to get to the outcome, right? And it's just work hard, or these steps, or whatever that might be. And until I said, you know what, I'm never gonna get the team here if I don't back up and say, hey, here's our vision, here's where we need to get, and then step away and realize these 14 people, or whatever that team might look like, will get to that vision if it's articulately explained to them, but they're not going to get there in the exact specific journey that you thought. So that I would have to say the biggest learning from being an athlete, of having your coach say, here's what we need you to get to, and ultimately here's how I need you to get to it. And then when you transition from an athlete to sort of the boardroom, if you will, you're not going to have somebody to tell you exactly how to get to those things. And as a leader, you need to be able to define what that final point is, and then ask for help. Hey, now guys, I need help to get here. So you can get a little bit of buy-in, and you can get a little bit of consensus with the group.
And how do you How did you develop that? Was that sheerly through experience? Was that, because it's a tough thing, right? When you're an athlete, feedback is readily available from the coaches, teammates, public, competition, so that feedback's always happening. When you're not necessarily seeing that sort of feedback instantaneously and managing teams and all that stuff, how does that process work for you?
It's so hard, isn't it? It's the hardest part about being an athlete, with constant pragmatic feedback, not, oh, I like you, but blah, blah, these things. Whereas the numbers said this, and we can't lie, and I want the numbers to be better, so here's what you need to do to get to those numbers. Where when you go into the business world, it's a lot of soft skills that you just don't have concrete feedback. But I think I failed a lot more in the beginning than I was prepared. So for example, and I will bring a kid story into this, but at Specialized, I traveled 7 straight months in a row. And I thought, gosh, this is just the way. This is just the way. You just have to work harder to get what you need, and you have to put in more time, and you just have to get down to the grind. And then I found out I was pregnant and knew I had to leave for maternity leave. And I thought, this place is going to sink without me. I can't imagine anyone is going to be able to continue this pull with me there. And so I said, hey, listen, I'll be back in 10 weeks. Here's what we need. Here's the trains on certain tracks, and here's what we need to see happen in the next 10 weeks for to get what we need to get out of this year's financials. And I came back, and oh my gosh, they surpassed my expectations. And that was the moment that I said, gosh, delegation is a skill that we don't typically learn as athletes. We don't get to say, hey, you know what, there's like 50 reps, can you do say 30 and I'll take a 20. You just don't learn delegate. You learn get in there, you got to do the work, and the work will pay off. But when you do transition, you realize you can't just be responsible for yourself and doing the work. You have to be able to delegate and then move out of the way and let the people get to work.
So it sounds like the transition was, as far as because this is what I've always found as a younger athlete as well, and I've said this a couple times before, is when you're younger, more immature athlete, you have to focus on your own individual performance and what you bring. But then as you grow and evolve and become more comfortable in what you can offer, you learn to put yourself in the context of the team. You know what I mean? And then the next progression, I imagine too, is okay, this is where I am individually, and then this is where I fit in the context of the team, and then this is where we all kind of need to go together and us to realize that vision that we want to say. So when you're in charge of marketing teams and you become president of Camelback and dealing with all the adversity, how do you maintain that perspective of actually measuring your own individual performance, your immediate team, and then also the direction you're going in, which I imagine you can relate back to your crew experiences, how do you get everyone rowing in the same direction all the time? Yeah,
and that's the unique part about rowing, right? No single athlete crosses a finish line. And definitely no single athlete has stats, if you will. So you have got to be in unison and perfection the entire time, where it doesn't really prepare you to say, all right, who's going to stand up and move this brand forward, especially during such a complicated leadership time. I've had some amazing time to reflect and that's a whole nother podcast, if you will, about the reflection of leading during complicated times. But just taking a quick glance is I knew what my boss was at Vista Outdoors. I knew what they needed our brand to do. I knew how I needed to translate that so that the team could get behind the idea that we are of the people, for the brand. And so there's this rough moment in the between of taking out sort of transactional needs for the business and putting it to an emotional and a spiritual way, so you could get consensus and people could understand oh, we're in it for the love of it, right, instead of for the transactional element of it. And I think as an athlete, you do, and especially being in the outdoor sector, right? So it's easy because most of the people have been athletes, or at least can have empathy. Yeah, can understand what it means to say, hey, we're on a journey. It's going to be a complicated journey, but it's because we have this amazing moment in time to look forward to, because we are Camelback, and we are the outdoors.
Can you share a little bit about, I know you kind of touched on it, but like managing that crisis, and now you've had an opportunity to reflect both, kind of maybe at a higher level individually, and then also how you think about teams and dealing with different people, and at the end of the day, managing the best you can with what you got in the environment that you're in. Because you didn't choose the situation, you assumed responsibility, right?
Yeah. And I'd say yes a million times over. Would I do few things different? For sure, I think we all would when we look back. But I am a little bit like Alexander Hamilton. I wasn't going to give away my shot. But when they said, "Hey, listen, we need you to lead this brand for a couple of months," I didn't have anything to lose. I'm like, yeah, give me a shot, and I'll give it everything I have. But then you don't really look in the crystal ball to say, hey, listen, it's just not my swim lane of, hey, here's what our plan was, and let's execute to plan. It's here's what our plan was, and now all these other things sort of came in that were out of our control. So what do we do with those things? So I am an insanely transparent leader to a fault, and I think I'd probably turn back the clock a little bit, because there's some things that the reason I am a leader is I can take on a lot of information and be able to pragmatically and compartmentalize some things, right? And there's a lot of people that just they don't have the aptitude, right? And that's not their job, and that's not their role. And so I think I would probably help with the context as we share transparency on that side. I think I would have made decisions that were right for the brand more than right for our parent brand, which would have landed me in the same situation I am now. But when we had gotten the call for the boycott, just a little side story on how I lead and how my thought process is I was sitting watching TV on a Sunday night, and it was right after the Parkland shooting, and if that hasn't changed, hundreds, if not thousands of people's lives, I don't know what could. But I knew it happened to a high school, so this is different than, a shooting that Vista would say, halt all communications about XYZ. And I knew the guy, and he's in San Francisco, and he just said, through Twitter, he said, hey, listen, did you guys know Camelback was owned by Vista, and Vista has tons of tentacles and firearms and ammunition. So I called our VP of communication at Vista, said, hey guys, this is what's happening. I'm going to call him. I know him through a couple of people. I'm just going to call him. I'm going to invite him up to Camelback. Let's have a conversation. I really think we could figure out how we could use Camelback's partnership with Vista as leverage on making some really positive change here. And the conversation I got is stand down, do not make contact, do not call them, do not anything. So I went back, and I never felt good about the decision that I had made to not call. And I feel like we would have been in definitely a different situation. So I do think leading a little bit by instinct, and athletes do have the instinct of where the ball is at, where the play needs to be run, and sort of the timing of your stroke and those types of things. We have a certain feel and an instinct about what may or may not be the right path. And that's one massive regret I have. I should have just made the call and dealt with the consequences as I saw fit. But
I mean, as an athlete as well, right? It's like you learn through failure, right? Each experience is a teacher, and then hopefully, we have the opportunity next week to demonstrate the learning from the previous game or race or whatever it was, and then transfer that into hopefully growth.
The higher you climb in your career, and whether it be athletic career or professional career, the stakes for failure is higher. So this whole notion of failing fast is scary and a little bit destructive. And so I do feel, yes, failure is needed. Everyone does it, but you just don't get the forgiveness when you're at a level that if it affects people's careers, it'll affect our bottom line, it affects their stakeholders, our shareholders, all the other folks. So it does put a lot more pressure on your shoulders to make the right decision with as much information you have. And and then make the decision, right? I think that's where leaders kind of a little bit analysis paralysis moments. But to be a great leader downward, you need to let the leaders fail, but not become failures.
Right.
So that's great that we get that opportunity as true leaders in our organization or in our networks, right? As we mentor people and as coaching becomes more sought out in terms of executive coaching. But as the leader, and when you don't really report to anyone except maybe a board, they're not going to say, we want you to fail and not become a failure. There's just those skills just aren't. They don't exist anymore, right? You were hired to make the right decision at the right time, and be accountable for those actions.
And it's,
upwards and downwards, right?
How do you balance that, right? So the upward management, and although you have ultimate accountability, there's like some challenges even with your responsibility, like you said, right? Where like you're ultimately responsible and accountable, but at the same time there are constraints to all that stuff. So you have to balance, manage upward, and then decisions based on like what that might do to compromise relationships one way or the other, because effectively you have to do what you feel is right, which is one, identifying and being able to be, this is who I am, this is what I believe. At the same time, manage all these various different elements. I imagine it's like one of the greatest challenges of leading a massive organization that you're responsible for.
Well, it's just like you going out to the pitch, right? Your coach has a plan. They have laid out that plan to you crystal clear, and you believe in that plan, right? And you're going to try as hard as you can to execute to that plan, because he's already gained consensus from you and belief in you, and you are believing in this coach, right? But the best laid plans sometimes are just not working out, right? So when you guys lose, when anybody loses or fails or however you want to depict it, you don't say like, coach, you came with a bad plan, right? You have a plan, you believe in the plan, you've thought about the plan, you ruminate on the plan, you sleep on it, you wake up, you obsess about this plan. And when it doesn't lay out, it's because, here are the moments in that plan that didn't work out. Whereas if you go in and haphazardly make a plan and not think about all the elements that might come up as much as possible, they can't figure out where you failed and where you can improve the next time. And I do think, reporting into a board or reporting into a founder or however that might work out, they respect the plan, right? I can come up easily and say, hey, listen, our goal, we've identified the problem. The problem is we need to get to X amount of revenue this year, or whatever the problem might be. And then we go and develop a couple of plans, right? And we flush out the plans with the leadership team. And then we kind of settle on the best plan that we all believe in. And once that's laid out and it does fail, we can say, hey, this was great. The plan was wrong. Or another outside source came in and we were thrown off our plan. But the reason I say that is because we're forgiven as leaders when we fail if we have the plan. And people understood the plan. The voila does not work, right? Of saying, I'm going to do all the work and then voila, it's going to be done. It just doesn't work anymore like that, because you need the people in the room. You need the buy-in in the room, and you need people to understand where you're going.
How do you identify what's most important, like as far as the plan goes, right? Like these are the things this is our plan, this is what we have identified, we're going to judge ourselves on, and this is what we're committed to. Mm-hmm. Like what does that analysis process look like for you as a leader? And then the collaboration that happens with your leadership group, like you say, like how does that work for you?
Gosh, it depends on whatever that goal might be, right? So if it's a revenue goal, we have to understand we get really nerdy. Yeah. Right. So if it says, hey, listen, we have a brand issue, then we go deep in research on what that issue is or what it means, or we have a revenue issue. And that revenue issues are, I think, a little bit easier to sort out, because you can negotiate on margin, you can have a due diligence on your supply chain. For me, it's a little bit more binary, where when you have a brand issue or an opportunity, it's a little bit more squishy, right? It's a little bit of a triage, but because you're working on a lot of these things across departments, right? So you have your operations team and your HR team and your finance team, and all these people have to be bought into your plan. And I keep going back to that because it does help to socialize it, because it does help you to influence upwards and downwards, especially as you go. As I was all these folks as peers for a long time, and then when you're an interim, not only am I assuming I'm going to be their peer again, but for a moment in time, I got to make some real hard decisions that they may or may not agree with me on.
And how did you balance that, right? So relationship as a peer, and probably personal friendships at that point, right? And then you transition to leadership, and like as we've kind of already talked about, it's a very conditional environment, right? It's based on what you get done, and you're all getting judged based on the numbers and all that kind of stuff, and you're ultimately responsible. And like you said, like failure, okay, even though it is potentially inevitable in any context, like it could be fatal in some contexts, right? So how was that transition for you?
Well, I knew I had to go find not necessarily an ally, but I needed to go find in the leadership team somebody who possessed all the skills I did not. So I didn't know much about operations during the whole time, and my ally in the team was the head of operations, and I knew he was going to tell me the truth, because as a leader, it is insanely lonely at the top. No one tells you, no one pokes holes in your ideas. People are just sort of nod their head and might have some feedback for you, but ultimately they'll go and execute what you've laid out in a lot of cases. And so I knew that in a profound way, especially at Camelback, but definitely in earlier brands. And so I was very careful about the words I would use, because it was a very literal culture. It was very culture to be like that. And so
Here's this, do that.
Here's this, or hey, I'm not feeling this product. What do you guys think about it? And they're instantly thinking in their mind, Tara's going to cut that line. That's not the case. I sort of just talk out loud, like brainstorm out loud. And so I would truly have to start a conversation and say, okay, so I'm just going to throw some things out. I'm going to think about this out loud, if you guys will let me.
And how did you maintain sort of a positive culture in the midst of a pretty chaotic situation?
Man, I am optimistically naive.
Person, right?
Yeah, like I can see a silver lining, and I love an underdog story. I really think I can't help it. I also had the benefit of people knew me within the industry as well, so they already knew the sort of, not necessarily cheerleader, but the optimistically naive leader that I am, of saying, hey, listen, if we get through this, imagine the story we could tell. And I think that's really a cool moment of being able to bring people in to imagine this comeback story, because people will see us and people will know us and believe in what we're trying to do and come along with us. And imagine if we could, I said this all the time, imagine if we could take more plastics out of the ocean. Imagine if we could figure out a water bottle that is completely biodegradable. So
now you've kind of sit on a couple boards now. Mm-hmm. Mom of four.
A mom of four. Yeah.
And so is it providing any sort of different perspective on sort of leadership now? Like obviously you have your reflection of your past experience and all that stuff, but also now that you're part of some sensei who's is one of the companies you sit on the board. Like is that process challenging in a different way, and actually this is a really cool perspective to kind of sit over the top and look at all these things and kind of jump in where you can.
Yeah, sitting on a board is interesting, right? Because I had said no to a bunch of board opportunities when I was sitting at president role and before, just because there was just no more time for me to dedicate. And before I jumped into something else, I wanted to go back and revisit a couple of really interesting moments that I think I could make a difference. And ultimately, I find myself saying, salivating, because I know I could get in there and really make some magic in the brand if I could just focus on this one brand. But what's really interesting about sitting on the board, because I presented into a board, you get the 30,000 foot view each and every time. and you don't really think about, or you don't have to think about the mundane daily, like what's your social media doing today, and what does your logo look on your site, and is Shopify integrated yet? All these things, but you get this really juicy moment to say, hey, what's the past, present, future of what this brand could be? And so there's this sort of middle chapter of your career that I feel like I'm entering, so I can be really mindful and purposeful on the next decision I'm making.
How would you define leadership?
There is a general that talks about a good leader is someone who lets you fail, but also doesn't make you become a failure. And that's quite interesting, right? So the moment of letting you get into a situation where you can make those pretty meaningful, those safe failures or fails or missteps, if you will, but also can lift you up and make sure you're on a great path or trajectory of teaching and learning.
Tara, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you, and thanks for everything.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This week's takeaways are all about creating team buy-in and how to approach failure. As Tara shared, being a strong communicator is vital to the success of any leader. Whether providing that two-way connection between coach and teammates or rallying employees around your company's vision, you must learn how to communicate effectively to create buy-in and shared purpose. You need to go above and beyond the dollars and cents. Translate the transactional needs of the brand into a purpose that employees can emotionally connect with and get behind. A plan can't work without strong communication. When a plan is built and socialized, everyone knows their role, which creates greater opportunity for success, as well as the ability to pivot when outside forces are at work. Let your team members have room to fail, but not become failures. Failing is all about learning and using that experience as a teacher. And finally, understand that micromanaging is not a sustainable leadership style. You can't personally work every part of the business. So build the plan, communicate the vision, delegate, and then get out of people's way.